June 6, 1944. 6:27 a.m. Strong Point WN-62, Omaha Beach. Oberstfreiter Franz Muller rubbed his eyes and looked through his MG-42's sights again. The pre-dawn mist was playing tricks. Had to be. He'd seen thousands of tanks in Russia, studied every Allied armor silhouette chart. He knew one absolute truth about tanks. They came on trains, on trucks, or drove themselves. They didn't swim. But there, 700 meters out in the churning gray Atlantic, a dark angular shape rose and fell with the waves. Not a landing craft. Not debris. The impossible shape had a turret. "Herr Lieutenant," he called to his officer, voice cracking. "The Americans, their tanks are swimming." Lieutenant Koch snatched the binoculars, studied the water for 3 seconds, then lowered them with a pale face. "God help us. Signal the 352nd Division immediately. The enemy has done something we never imagined possible." In precisely 4 minutes, those swimming tanks would transform the entire German defensive strategy into obsolete scrap metal. Franz had been at his position since midnight, watching the dark horizon where sea met sky. The concrete bunker smelled of gun oil, stale cigarettes, and fierce sweat from the 50 men crammed inside. They all knew the invasion was coming. You could feel it in the air, thick as the morning fog. For 2 years, they had prepared for this moment. Every possible landing scenario had been drilled into them. The officers had shown them diagrams of how the Americans would come. Landing craft would hit the beach, ramps would drop, infantry would pour out, and then, only then, would tanks arrive on special flat-bottomed boats. That was the sequence. That was how amphibious invasions worked. The tanks always came last, after the beach was secured. Always. But now Franz watched as more dark shapes appeared in the water. 1 became 3. 3 became 7. They moved wrong for boats, too low in the water, appearing and disappearing with each wave like metal whales surfacing for air. He could make out the distinctive angular turret of a Sherman tank, the long barrel of its 75mm gun pointing directly at the beach. The impossible was happening. The tanks were coming first, and they were coming from the sea itself. Around him, other men began to notice. Whispers spread through the bunker like wildfire. "Schwimmen Panzer," they muttered to each other. "Swimming tanks." Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Others gripped their weapons tighter, understanding that if the Americans could make tanks swim, what else had they prepared that nobody expected? Lieutenant Koch was on the field telephone now, shouting to be heard over the growing noise of naval bombardment that had started 10 minutes ago. "No, this is not a mistake. I can see them clearly. American tanks in the water, approaching the beach. They have some kind of, I don't know, flotation screens around them. Yes, I'm certain. At least a dozen now." Franz could hear the disbelief on the other end of the line, even from 5 meters away. Nobody wanted to believe it. The entire German defensive plan for the Atlantic Wall depended on predictable sequences. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover the beaches where tanks would unload from landing craft. Obstacles and mines were placed where tanks would have to drive after rolling off the ramps. Everything was calculated based on where tanks should be, not where they impossibly were right now. The swimming tanks were now 500 meters out, and Franz could see them more clearly. Canvas screens rose up around each tank like walls, keeping them afloat. 2 small propellers churned the water behind them. They moved slowly, maybe 4 kilometers per hour, fighting against the waves. Some disappeared entirely when large swells rolled over them, only to emerge again, still advancing. It was like watching a nightmare become real. These machines weighed 32 tons. Steel and iron that heavy didn't float. It was against the laws of physics, against everything Franz had learned in his 2 years of combat. Yet there they were, proof that the Americans had changed the rules of war while the Germans were still playing by the old ones. The first swimming tank reached the outer line of obstacles at 6:31 a.m. Franz watched as its canvas screen suddenly collapsed, falling away like a theater curtain. The tank settled onto the sandy bottom in 3 feet of water, tracks finding purchase, and began driving up the beach like it had always belonged there. Its gun fired immediately, the shell screaming over Franz's bunker to hit an anti-tank position 100 meters behind him. The explosion told Franz everything he needed to know. These weren't just swimming tanks. They were fully operational, ready to fight the moment they touched land. The careful German plan, 2 years in the making, had just become useless. The tanks were supposed to be the last threat, not the first. Now they were here, and the infantry positions designed to stop foot soldiers would have to somehow face armor. Franz pressed the trigger of his MG-42, knowing the bullets would bounce harmlessly off the Sherman's hull, but needing to do something, anything, against the impossible thing he was witnessing. The age of predictable warfare had just ended on a French beach, drowned by swimming tanks. The secret of the swimming tanks had been guarded as carefully as the invasion date itself. 6 months earlier, in the cold waters of a Scottish loch, American tank crews had thought their commanders had gone insane. Sergeant Tom Bradley from Iowa remembered the first briefing when Major Harrison held up a canvas screen and announced they were going to make their 32-ton Shermans float. The room had erupted in laughter. Bradley himself had asked if they were also going to teach the tanks to fly. But the major wasn't joking. The British had invented something called the duplex drive system, DD for short, and the Americans were going to use it for the invasion of Europe. The principle was simple enough to explain, but seemed impossible to believe. A collapsible canvas screen would be attached around the tank's hull, rising up like walls to create a boat-shaped container. The tank's own weight would push it down into the water, but the air trapped inside the canvas walls would keep it afloat, barely. 2 small propellers powered by the tank's engine would push it forward at about 4 miles per hour. That was the theory. The first training attempts had been disasters. Tanks sank when crews raised the screens too slowly. They sank when waves came over the canvas walls. They sank when drivers turned too sharply. In one terrible afternoon, 3 crews had to escape from their tanks as they went down in 8 feet of water. Men who had joined the army to fight in tanks found themselves learning to swim in full combat gear. But slowly, painfully, they learned the rhythm of it. Raise the screens quickly but smoothly. Keep the tank perfectly balanced. Never stop the propellers. Watch the waves and angle into them just right. Move the turret slowly to avoid shifting the center of gravity. Pump out water constantly with the bilge pumps. It was more like sailing than driving, and these farm boys from Kansas and city kids from New York had to become sailors overnight. They practiced in calm water first, then in waves, then in storms. They launched from landing craft 2 miles offshore and swam to beaches again and again until it became second nature. The engineers had made other changes to these special tanks that the Germans never discovered. The ammunition was stored in wet bins, surrounded by water and antifreeze mixture. This meant that even if a shell penetrated the armor, the ammunition wouldn't explode immediately like in regular Shermans. The canvas screens weren't just cloth, but had rubber coating and multiple air chambers, so even if one section tore, the tank might stay afloat. Extra pumps were installed to handle water that came over the walls. Waterproof radios let them communicate while swimming. These weren't just floating tanks, but swimming fortresses designed to survive both the journey through water and the battle that followed. The crews trained in absolute secrecy. The loch was surrounded by military police. Local civilians were told they were testing new camping equipment. When German reconnaissance planes flew over, the tanks would quickly sink their screens and submerge slightly, looking like failed experiments. Intelligence officers made sure German spies reported back that the Americans were desperately trying ridiculous ideas that kept failing. The real test had come during rehearsals off the English coast. Exercise Tiger in April had gone wrong when German torpedo boats attacked the practice convoy. But even in that disaster, the DD tanks had proven their worth. The ones that made it to shore provided immediate fire support that saved hundreds of lives. The crew commanders learned that timing was everything. Launch too far out, and the crews would be exhausted fighting waves for hours. Launch too close, and they lost the element of surprise. 2 to 3 miles seemed perfect, just far enough that German observers wouldn't immediately recognize them as tanks. The psychological impact had been clear even in training. British officers watching the exercises reported that seeing tanks emerge from the sea had an almost mythological quality, like ancient sea monsters rising from the deep. If it unsettled friendly forces who knew it was coming, what would it do to enemies who didn't? The final piece of the secret was the scale of the operation. This wasn't just a few experimental tanks. The Allies had converted hundreds of Shermans into DD variants. 5 tank battalions had been trained in their operation. On June 6th, they would launch in waves, with backup tanks on regular landing craft in case the swimming tanks failed. But the first wave, the shock wave, would come from the sea. The Germans had built their Atlantic wall to stop an invasion they could predict. They had placed obstacles where tanks should drive, guns where tanks should unload, and mines where tanks should advance. They had never imagined tanks would bypass all of that by swimming directly to the beach. The morning of June 6th, as Franz Müller stared in disbelief at the impossible sight, he was witnessing the culmination of months of secret preparation. Every sunken tank in training, every drowned crew member who had been quietly buried, every successful practice run had led to this moment when the impossible became reality and the laws of armored warfare were rewritten in salt water and canvas. The collapse of German beach defenses happened in stages, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Colonel Werner Kruger commanded the 352nd Infantry Division's anti-tank defenses, and he had positioned his guns with mathematical precision. Every 88mm gun, every Pak-40, every anti-tank position had been placed to create overlapping fields of fire where tanks would emerge from landing craft. The kill zones were perfect on paper. Tanks would have to cross 300 meters of open beach under concentrated fire. The calculations showed that no tank could survive more than 90 seconds in those zones. But the calculations assumed tanks would arrive where tanks were supposed to arrive. Now Kruger stood in his command post, reading impossible reports from the beach. Tanks were appearing behind his forward gun positions. They were emerging from the surf at points where no anti-tank guns could target them. His beautiful mathematical defense was useless because the Americans had changed the basic equation. The first German gun crew to face a DD Sherman directly was commanded by Unteroffizier Paul Weber. He had positioned his Pak-40 anti-tank gun to cover the beach exit, where tanks would have to funnel through after unloading. Instead, he watched in horror as a Sherman emerged from the waves 200 meters to his left, completely outside his field of fire. Weber screamed at his men to traverse the gun, but the Pak-40 was dug into a concrete position that only allowed 30 degrees of movement. They would have to dig it out and reposition it entirely. As his men grabbed shovels and picks, the Sherman's turret turned toward them. Weber saw the muzzle flash and felt the shell pass over his head before the sound reached him. The second shot didn't miss. The carefully prepared position that had taken 2 months to construct was destroyed in less than 2 minutes by a tank that wasn't supposed to exist. This scene repeated across the 6-mile stretch of beach. Anti-tank guns that couldn't rotate far enough. Mines placed where swimming tanks never traveled. Obstacles in the water that the tanks simply drove around after dropping their screens. The psychological impact spread faster than the tanks themselves. Radio operators reported swimming tanks and were told they were seeing things. Officers who repeated these reports were accused of panic. Major Friedrich Hoffmann actually placed 2 of his subordinates under arrest for spreading what he called defeatist propaganda about impossible American weapons. By the time he reached the forward positions and saw the swimming tanks himself, his entire sector had collapsed. The German doctrine called for immediate counterattack against any beach landing, but that doctrine assumed they would know where the enemy was strongest. With tanks appearing seemingly randomly from the sea, there was no clear point to counterattack. Reserves that should have moved forward stayed in place, waiting for clearer orders that never came. The careful German system of defense, built on predictability and preparation, shattered against the chaos of the impossible. The Sherman tanks that survived the swim were worth more than their weight in ammunition. Staff Sergeant Mike Peterson's tank had barely made it through the waves, taking on so much water that the driver could feel it sloshing around his feet. But once on the beach, his tank became a mobile pillbox that infantry could shelter behind. The psychological effect on American troops was the exact opposite of what the Germans experienced. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez from Texas later said that seeing tanks rise from the ocean like that made him believe Americans could do anything. If they could make tanks swim, they could win the war. The German soldiers facing them had the opposite revelation. If the Americans had hidden swimming tanks from them, What else did they have? Wild rumors spread through German lines about invisible planes, bullets that curved around corners, and soldiers who couldn't be killed. The actual swimming tanks had broken more than just defensive lines. They had broken the German confidence in their own intelligence and planning. The reports that reached German high command that afternoon were so confused that many officers refused to believe them. General Marks at the 84th Corps headquarters spent precious hours trying to verify whether tanks were really swimming or if his men were suffering from combat hallucinations. The delay meant that reserves that should have been released immediately were held back. Artillery that should have targeted the beach was kept silent, while officers argued about whether the reports could be trusted. One German intelligence officer actually insisted that the Allies must have built underwater bridges during the night, because tank swimming was physically impossible. By the time the German command accepted that DD tanks were real, it was too late. The beaches had been taken, the follow-up waves were landing, and the careful Atlantic wall had been breached not by superior firepower, but by something the Germans had never imagined. The swimming tanks had done more than provide fire support. They had shattered German certainty about how war worked. Every assumption, every plan, every carefully calculated defense position had been made worthless by canvas screens and propellers. The mighty Atlantic wall hadn't been destroyed. It had been made irrelevant by tanks that swam. The tragedy within the triumph was written in salt water and steel. Of the 29 DD Sherman tanks assigned to Omaha Beach, only 2 made it to shore. The others now sat on the ocean floor, tombs for their 5-man crews. The weather had betrayed them. 6-foot waves that morning were far beyond what they had trained for in Scottish locks. Tank Commander Sergeant Robert Mason had known they were in trouble the moment his Sherman rolled off the landing craft ramp 5,000 yards from shore. The naval officer had launched them too far out, afraid to bring his valuable landing craft closer to German guns. Mason watched his canvas screen flex and bend with each wave. Water poured over the walls faster than the pumps could handle. He ordered his driver to angle into the waves, but it was like trying to steer a brick with a tablecloth wrapped around it. The tank lasted 7 minutes before the screen collapsed on the left side. Mason and 2 of his crew made it out. The driver and gunner went down with 32 tons of steel into 40 feet of water. They were 19 and 21 years old. But at Gold Beach and Sword Beach, where British and Canadian forces landed, the story was completely different. The Royal Navy officers brought their landing craft much closer to shore, some as close as 1,000 yards. The British tank crews had trained for an extra month and had developed their own techniques. They moved in groups, with the lead tank breaking the waves for those behind. They had waterproofed their tanks with extra care, using a special putty compound around every bolt and rivet. Most importantly, they had lucky weather on their side. The eastern beaches had calmer waters that morning, with waves barely 3 feet high. Of the 40 DD tanks launched at Gold Beach, 28 made it to shore. At Sword Beach, 31 out of 34 survived the swim. These numbers meant everything for the soldiers waiting to attack those beaches. Where Omaha became a bloodbath partly because of missing tank support, the British and Canadian beaches had immediate armor support that saved thousands of lives. The German after-action reports revealed the full extent of their intelligence failure. They had actually observed DD tanks training months before the invasion. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos from February showed strange canvas structures around Allied tanks in Scotland. A German agent in Portsmouth had reported seeing tanks with unusual modifications. A French resistance member working as a double agent had even provided sketches of the canvas screens. But every piece of intelligence had been dismissed or misinterpreted. Colonel Otto Brandt of Wehrmacht Intelligence had written in his assessment that the Allies were clearly desperate if they were trying to make tanks float, and that these experiments would obviously fail. He classified the DD tank program as a propaganda effort meant to boost Allied morale rather than a serious military innovation. The idea that tanks could swim was so far outside German military thinking that they couldn't process the evidence right in front of them. They had seen what they expected to see, which was failure, rather than what was actually there, which was revolution. The long-term impact of the DD tanks went far beyond D-Day itself. Within weeks, German defensive doctrine had to be completely rewritten. They could no longer assume that water was a barrier to armor. Every river defense, every canal line, every flooded field that they had counted on to stop tanks was now questionable. German commanders had to spread their anti-tank guns across much wider areas, weakening their concentrated firepower. They had to keep reserves further forward, making them vulnerable to Allied aircraft. The psychological damage was even worse. If the Allies could hide something as massive as hundreds of swimming tanks, what else were they hiding? German intelligence began seeing threats everywhere, wasting resources investigating every wild rumor. Reports of Allied superweapons, most of them completely fictional, were now taken seriously because nobody wanted to be the officer who dismissed another swimming tank. The British continued developing the technology after D-Day. They created improved versions that could handle rougher water and swim faster. The DD system was adapted for other vehicles, including armored personnel carriers and self-propelled guns. The Soviets, impressed by what they had seen, began their own amphibious tank programs. The Americans incorporated the lessons learned into new vehicle designs. The principle that armor could be made amphibious changed military planning worldwide. Rivers were no longer reliable defensive lines. Coastal defenses had to account for armor coming from the sea. The simple canvas screen and propeller system had shifted the entire calculus of military geography. What had started as a British engineer's wild idea to put a boat hull around a tank had become a new chapter in warfare. The Germans learned too late that when someone shows you the impossible, you should believe them, because in war, the impossible only stays that way until someone figures out how to do it. The DD tanks had proven that innovation could overcome any defensive preparation, no matter how thorough, if the defender refused to believe the innovation was possible. The lessons from the swimming tanks extended far beyond the beaches of Normandy and into the nature of warfare itself. Military historians would spend decades analyzing how such a simple innovation had caused such massive disruption. Professor James Mitchell at West Point would later write that the DD tanks represented a perfect storm of innovation, deception, and cognitive blindness. The innovation part was straightforward enough. Nicholas Strasser, a Hungarian-born engineer working for the British, had taken two existing technologies, flotation screens and propeller drives, and combined them in a way nobody had tried before. But innovation alone wasn't enough. The Japanese had developed amphibious tanks before the war, and the Soviets had experimented with floating vehicles. What made the DD tanks different was how they were hidden and revealed. The Allies had understood that the weapon's greatest power wasn't its ability to swim, but the enemy's inability to believe it could. The deception campaign around the DD tanks became a textbook example of military misdirection. Every time the tanks trained, spotters watched for German reconnaissance aircraft. When planes appeared, tank crews would deliberately sync their screens partially, making it look like the experiments were failing. Allied intelligence officers planted false reports suggesting the amphibious tank program had been cancelled due to repeated failures. They even staged fake arguments at ports where German spies were known to operate, with officers loudly complaining about resources wasted on impossible projects. Meanwhile, the real training continued in remote Scottish lochs and isolated beaches where no enemy eyes could watch. The crews were told that talking about their training would be treated as treason. Letters home were censored so heavily that families joked their soldiers must be doing nothing at all. One tank driver's mother received a letter that was entirely blacked out except for the words "Dear Mom" and "Love, Jimmy." She thought her son had become a spy. In a way, she was right. Every DD tank crew member was part of one of the war's greatest secrets. The German failure to anticipate swimming tanks revealed a deeper problem in military thinking that still applies today. They had fallen victim to what psychologists now call confirmation bias. Because German doctrine said tanks couldn't swim, any evidence that they might swim was explained away. The canvas screens must be camouflage. The propellers must be for crossing shallow rivers. The reports of floating tanks must be Allied propaganda to confuse German planning. Each piece of evidence was forced to fit the existing belief rather than challenging it. General Heinz Guderian, the famous Panzer commander, later admitted that the German High Command had become so confident in their technical superiority that they couldn't imagine the Allies surpassing them. They believed German engineering was the best in the world, and if Germany hadn't made swimming tanks, then swimming tanks couldn't be made. This arrogance blinded them to obvious evidence and cost them the Atlantic Wall. The impact on modern military doctrine was immediate and lasting. Within months of D-Day, every major military was developing amphibious armor. The Americans created the LVT, Landing Vehicle Tract, which could swim from ship to shore carrying troops or supplies. The Soviets developed the PT-76, a light tank designed from the ground up to be amphibious. The British continued refining the DD system, eventually creating vehicles that could swim across rivers at 10 miles per hour. But more importantly, military planners learned to expect the unexpected. The phrase swimming tanks became shorthand for any innovation that seemed impossible but might be real. Intelligence services were restructured to prevent confirmation bias. Multiple analysts would review the same evidence independently. Devil's advocate positions were created, where officers were specifically tasked with arguing for unlikely possibilities. The question changed from, "Is this possible?" to "What if it is possible and we're wrong?" The story of the DD tanks also changed how militaries thought about technology and psychology in war. The actual military value of the swimming tanks was limited. They were slow in water, vulnerable to weather, and many were lost. But their psychological impact was worth entire divisions. They shattered German confidence, disrupted command structures, and created chaos where there should have been order. This lesson resonated through the Cold War and into modern conflicts. The Americans would use the same principle in the Gulf War, letting Iraq observe failed tests of certain weapons while hiding the successful ones. The Israelis would apply it in their conflicts, deliberately showing weaknesses that weren't real while concealing strengths that were. In Ukraine today, both sides use misdirection about their capabilities, understanding that making an enemy doubt their assumptions is as powerful as any weapon. The swimming tanks of D-Day proved that warfare isn't just about having better weapons, but about using them in ways the enemy cannot imagine. They showed that the most dangerous innovation is the one that challenges basic assumptions about what is possible. And most importantly, they demonstrated that in war, the side that stops believing in the impossible is the side that loses to it. Every military academy in the world now teaches the lesson of the DD tanks, not as a historical curiosity, but as a warning that somewhere, someone is working on the next impossible weapon that will make current defenses obsolete.